right now.
Okay. Are you ready to go? All right. Aloha mai kako, everyone. I want to welcome you to our session. Thank you for coming and joining us. This is Talk Story, World War II and Incarceration Stories of Hawaii. I want to thank all of our panelists and also the Japanese American Memorial Pilgrimages and all the other co-sponsors for putting on this amazing series of events. My name is Kajihiro. I'm a lecturer in ethnic studies and geography at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. I'm also involved with the group Hawaii Peace and Justice, and formerly was a program coordinator with the American Friends Service Committee Hawaii Area Program. The World War II incarceration of persons of Japanese and Okinawan ancestry in Hawaii is one of the biggest open secrets. Growing up in Hawaii, I heard about these camps on the continent, but we really didn't know what was happening in Hawaii, and it's still new information is still emerging as researchers are delving into the record. So this is an amazing opportunity to hear from some survivors of World War II experiences, others whose family members were affected by the war and the incarceration policies of the United States, and really, I'm going to be learning a lot here myself from these speakers. So I'll briefly introduce our panelists. Then each will have 10 minutes to share their stories and perspectives on the war and the incarceration of Japanese in Hawaii. And then we'll have some time at the end for question and discussions. So first of all, we're very honored and thankful to have two survivors who experienced the incarceration of their family members on Kauai. Elsie Saito grew up on Kauai during World War II. She was an elementary school teacher in Northern California and now lives in Southern California. Hi, Elsie.
Hi.
Betty Meltzer. Welcome. Betty Meltzer
Hello.
is Elsie's sister. She's a writer and an English instructor who now lives in Southern California. Welcome, Betty.
Thank you.
And Dr. Adam Miyashiro is Okinawan from Kahalu'u, Oahu. He's an associate professor of literature at Stockton University in New Jersey and currently resides in Philadelphia. And he'll be sharing about the incarceration of his family members. Thank you for joining us, Adam. And finally, Eric Wada is a Hawaiian Studies research teacher at Fern Elementary School on Oahu. He's a researcher and cultural practitioner of Okinawan and Hawaiian history and culture, and is a co-founder and director of Ukwanshin Kabudan, which is a very important Okinawan performing arts group that has played a role in revitalization of Okinawan language and culture in Hawaii. And he'll be discussing the little known history of Okinawan prisoners of war who were brought to Honouliuli camp in Hawaii. So welcome, Eric. And so first of all, we wanted to ask Elsie if you would begin and introduce yourself and share your story. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. I'm Elsie Saito, and I lived in Hawaii on the island of Kauai, and now live in Southern California. I was, you want me to go into some of my background? Like, I was born, I was 5 years old, I think, when World War II started. And I was in kindergarten, and I came home from school, and I found my mom in the kitchen, and she's crying. And I've never seen her cry before. And so I was so surprised. And I asked her, "Why are you crying?" And she said, "They took him away." And I didn't know who they was, but I think they were the FBI. They came and they took my father. And so we didn't even get to see him, because we come home from school and we saw Dad before, and now he's gone. And so anyway, my dad was interned, and he was interned in Kajihiro. I guess I noticed on the map they have Kajihiro Stockade. I think that must be the one then, because that's the only one that. Thank you. Yes, that's the only one that they had on Kauai at that time, and it's only like about maybe 2 miles away from our home. But you know, we never got to see my dad during that period when he was in that Kajihiro Stockade. The only person who was able to visit my dad was my mother. And so whenever my mother wanted to see my dad, she didn't drive, so she would ask one of my cousins to drive her there. And sometimes we would, some of us kids wanted to just go for the ride because we knew we couldn't see my dad at all. But see, my mom had 6 young children, and she also had my father's elderly parents that lived with us in the town of Wrongfully on the island of Kauai. And so it was very difficult for my mother. She couldn't, you know, she had these young kids, she had 6 of us kids. And so she really couldn't, you know, go to work or anything. Somebody had to, you know, take care of us. And so at first, I guess we thought my dad was targeted because he was active in our small community where we lived, and he was also very active in the Buddhist church. But that was not it. That was not the real reason why. We found out later. I think maybe Betty could talk about some of that because she did some research on it. Let's see. Is there anything else I wanted to add to that? It was, I know one thing that it was very hard for the family because there was no income coming in. And my mom had, like I mentioned before, 6 young children and 2 elderly, you know, my father's parents were living with us. And so I remember when she told me one day, can you help me? And I went with her, and she went to the front yard, and she asked me to help her. And what she was doing was she was picking off the dead lily plants, the dead lily flowers. And it turned out that was our dinner. She had to make do with a lot of unusual, you know, foods that were, you know, available for us. So I remember when I thought about that, I thought, oh, that must have been hard for my mom to think that she had to do things like that, you know, but no income. So she had to try to find ways to feed, you know, the 6 kids and, you know, the elderly grandparents that we had living with us.
When did they take your father? Was it right after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, or was it a little later?
You know, I was so young that I don't know exactly if it was, you know, very soon after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, but somehow I would think that maybe that could have been the reason, you know. But like I said, my mother was the only one who could visit my dad in camp. So it was a rough time because, you know, we missed our dad, of course, you know, but we could only jump in the car and just, you know, go for the ride. But then, you know, mom would go in to see our dad, and we just had to wait in the car. But we just thought that was, you know, just going for a ride was going to take care of things, but that didn't, of course.
How long was he in the detention center?
You know, I can't even remember how long it was because I was so young. But there was I remember one incident. I was in our front yard. We had a big front yard. And for some reason, I was sitting there all by myself. For what reason, I don't know. And then I saw this big truck come by right and stopped in front of our house. And I looked out and I go, oh my God, my father is coming home. They dropped him off. We didn't even know he was when or where he was coming, when he was coming home. And so I ran in the house. I remember I said, Dad's home, Dad's home. But I can't remember if anyone heard me because I was so excited about Dad being home. But it was such a strange situation because we didn't see Dad. But then all of a sudden, somebody drive this big, truck with a number of men in it. And I guess they were all the men that were being, sent home from that Kajihiro stockade. So it was such a strange, I remember feeling, but, we were so glad that we were able to finally have our dad home. I don't know if there's any other questions that you may have, but as far as right now, I've just written down a few things, that I thought I would share with you. So if you have questions.
Those are amazing stories and recollections, and how shocking that must have been for a young girl to experience that.
Yeah, it really was, especially when I came home from kindergarten and I saw my mom crying. I thought, what's happening? And she said they took him away, and I go, who's they? I guess I wasn't smart enough at that 5-year-old to say, who are they? Probably the FBI, yeah, because that's how they ended up, I guess, being selected to go into that stockade, Kajihiro stockade. Okay, from what I can, there was one more thing I remember. I think my mom must have shared that with us, that when the FBI came to our home, they asked my mother, where is the picture of the emperor? And she's going, we don't have a picture of the emperor. And the thing is, as they were going through the house, and several different times they would say that, where is the photo of the emperor? I guess they thought she was lying, and then maybe if they caught her off guard, she would say, oh, it's there, But we never had a picture of the emperor. What for? We're American citizens. So,
wow, it's amazing.
Yeah.
How did the community support you folks when in that time of hardship, or do you remember how the response was from others?
I don't recall much about the community, because my dad was very active in our small town. He did a lot of things, like when people needed help, or something happened. Like, for example, here's one good example. One of the young men in our neighborhood went. He was part of that group from Hawaii that went to fight the war, World War II. Mm-hmm. When he came back, he was in a German prisoner of war camp. Oh. And so he came back. And so my dad and all the people from the community had a real big, welcome home for him. We had all the food and, everything. Everyone was so happy to see this young man from our community. So that was, one of the things that Dad did. But yeah, he was also very active in the Buddhist, church.
Yeah. But Elsie, I think we will move on to your sister now, Betty. Okay. But thank you so much for that, and then we'll open it up for more questions and discussion afterwards.
Thank you.
All right, Betty, welcome, and please, if you could add to Elsie's story, we'd love to know more about why your father was incarcerated.
Hello?
Hello. Yes, Betty.
Hello?
Please-
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay,
please-
now,
please sh-
it was a complete surprise to all of us as to why our dad was taken in. It turned out later on, when I wrote to find out after the war, that since he had been in a situation where when his parents had come from Japan, they had decided that they would be in a it was called, where they that if they didn't like Hawaii, they could return to Japan. Now, I think that put the men of the family, especially, in a bad position, because when the war came around, it meant that they showed, perhaps some amount of friendship with Japan, and that was not the intention at all. It was that my grandfather, who didn't know English, he may have misunderstood, and I think he put some of the other persons in his family in a situation where if you were classifying people, you would say, this group decided they might want to return to Japan. And although they didn't really want to return to Japan, how would they know at the time they came in? So, they didn't know we would be at war with Japan at any time. But after a while, when I don't know exactly how long my father was in camp, because we were very young and we didn't quite understand what was going on. But in order for us to be fed, there was a principal at the Koloa school who gave us, as I recall, free lunch tickets so we could eat lunch at school. And Elsie would probably remember his name. I used to know it, now I've forgotten. He came from the mainland, and he was principal of Koloa School, and he was very kind in giving us free lunch, so at least we would have one meal per day, and whatever my mother could rustle up at home would be the other meals. And I thought it was, now in retrospect, I know he was being very kind to us. I don't know what the rule was at that time, whether he did it out of his own volition or he was told to do so, or somebody put in some good word for us or what, I have no idea. But we did have lunch tickets at Koloa School.
Well, I think the principal's name was Bachman.
Bachman, yeah. Bachman. And I've tried to find him. I've never found him. But he was very kind to us. So, way later on, when I was grown up, after I had gone to college and so on, I said, maybe I can find him, but I never did. And he was much older than we were, so maybe he was already had passed on by then. But whoever he was, wherever he had come from, I think he had come directly from the mainland to work in Hawaii. He had been kind to us because he knew that the lunch ticket would at least give us one meal per day. But meanwhile, I don't know what my mother and my grandparents are eating at home, while we were gone at school. Fortunately, we had a vegetable garden, so we had a few vegetables, but obviously things like meat and any foods one would buy from a store, they were very difficult. I don't know how my mother made it through to feed all of us. It's still a mystery to me how she did it.
Can I ask a clarifying question, Betty?
Hmm.
That intention to return to Japan, where was that? What sort of questionnaire was that? Was that when your grandparents?
I don't know.
immigrated?
When I think what happened is at that time, immigration was not what it is today. I
Okay.
think that some of the pineapple companies and the sugarcane companies had a hand in immigration because they were the ones who were bringing in people from Japan, the Philippines, China, and so on into Hawaii to work in the fields or in the factories of, either pineapple or sugarcane.
Right.
And
Okay.
I'm young to know the information on that.
We have a question from the audience. When your father was released, was he free to do as he pleased, or did he have to like check in from time to time? Did they have some surveillance on him? Do you
I don't
recall?
think he had to check in, but I don't think he had to check in. However, he had a very hard time finding a job because, the onus of having been in camp would not have, some employers may have thought maybe there was some taint in his background that he may have done something bad, which he had not. But you know how it is. In a war situation, people get very fearful of maybe hiring somebody who might have been had been in a camp. So
Right.
he had a hard time finding a job.
The stigma, yeah, that attaches. And
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Mhm.
Uh-huh.
Did you have any as children in schools? How did other children treat you folks? Was it a issue?
No, they treated us we were treated okay. There was no prejudice against us because there were not many, but several families were affected by having a male in a camp. But
Mhm.
not. I was so young. It was the first, second grade that I don't have too much of a exactly what was going on, but at school we were treated very differently because we didn't with other people. We were not dismissed or no one called us names or anything.
That's good. Did you have
And
other
it was because a large amount, a large group in course were Japanese Americans and people whose grandparents were foreigners.
Mhm. Did you have other stories you wanted to share with us in the few minutes we have here?
Yeah, it worried me that mother was going to carry on because she had not only the children but she had my grandparents, my father's mother and father, and my father had also taken in 4 nephews that had passed away. My father's sister's son, and it turned out as the war went on that they signed to go be soldiers in the war. I think they were all battalion from Hawaii.
Okay.
So they were fighting in Europe, and meanwhile, their uncle, who had taken care of them, was in a camp.
Yeah.
There's a question from the audience for Betty and Elsie. Did your father ever talk about the time that he had been incarcerated? Did he ever share his own experiences?
Elsie, go ahead. You start.
I don't recall anyone asking about that. Have you, Betty?
No, but I think people misunderstood because I know I misunderstood until I'd actually asked our government way afterwards, after I'd gone to college and everything, about his records. which some of which I did receive. And at first, during the war, being young, I thought perhaps they thought he had done something bad against the U.S. government, and it was not so. What had put him in that situation was that he had dual citizenship, I think, at the time, that his father had not released the Japanese, citizenship, because he thought perhaps if they didn't like Hawaii,
Right. They would be disloyal.
When he came over, he thought, if we have children and they don't like this, we can go back to Japan.
Right. But that was suspect, yeah. Well, Betty, we'd like to hear more, but let's move on to the next speaker, and then after we can have talk story all together. But thank you so much for sharing that. It's really fascinating.
It's okay.
Yeah. All right. So next we have Adam Miyashiro. Adam, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Kyle. Thank you, Elsie and Betty, for sharing your stories. And I want to thank also the offstage people, Kimiko and Caroline, for hosting this, and Japanese American pilgrimages. So I want to thank everybody involved in this. I think it's really important too that I'm gonna say, like, I'm gonna kind of begin with December 7, 1941, because it was kind of unusual. In my my family story kind of begins really on that day. Like for all of this, it was my grandfather was a sugarcane factory worker in Ava, and at the time they were living somewhere up by Schofield. I don't know exactly where it was, but on that day was my Uncle Toshi's first birthday. So he was born December 7, 1940. And so my grandfather was actually driving a birthday cake from Waipahu up back home when the bombing started. And he went up the road, Kunia Road. He was the only truck on the road, and the Japanese bombers shot at him, right, while he was driving. So he had to peel off, and if you know that area, he peeled off into the sugarcane, and he hid for the rest of the day until the bombing stopped. Yeah. So he waited, and of course, that like the whole island, the whole island of Oahu got bombed too. Like it's not just we just think of Pearl Harbor or Pu'uloa, right? But like Kaneohe, Mokapu Peninsula was bombed. A lot of places around the island. So it wasn't like a located area, right? Like so. But my family then, because of my grandfather's participation in the Jikoen Honganji mission, the Okinawan Buddhist temple, he and my grandma and two uncles and an aunt were all placed in detention. And we think that they were at first in Sand Island before they were transferred to Honouliuli. So they were in there from 42 to 45. And, one of the things about my own family is that it was extremely traumatic for the entire family, generationally, that event. So people in my family didn't really want to talk about it. There was, and I'll come to another point about this later, but there were only something like, a few thousand people interned in Hawaii because they couldn't, like 75% or so of the population were of Japanese ancestry at the time. So you couldn't like put everybody in prison. Now that wasn't the case here on the continent, where everybody of Japanese ancestry were put into camps. So there was a different sensibility about who was in the camps in Hawaii as opposed to the continent. So my family basically became destitute from this internment. and being poor already, and taking away whatever was there to begin with, they became even poorer. So there wasn't a, on the one hand, there wasn't a whole lot of recognition about what had happened throughout the 1950s. Talking about citizenship, my grandfather I don't think, ever became an American citizen. He didn't have citizenship at the time. He was born in Okinawa. He never, when it finally became legal for him to seek citizenship, he never did. So there was that feeling about it. I know that in my family, nobody really talked about it. No one really wanted to talk about it. And it was actually in the 1980s when there was the apology and the reparations that there was actually a kind of an erasure of the people who were in prison in Hawaii. And it was very difficult for people to either claim the reparation. So actually it was my aunt who was in there. She actually was originally denied. She filed for my whole family for those who had been in there. My father was born born later, so he wasn't in, but it was my two aunts, uncle, and my grandmother they were the only surviving members at the time. So she had actually submitted the paperwork, and it was rejected because there wasn't a recognition that Hawaii had these camps. So it was actually like Patsy Mink who helped her, right? Because she had to get the documentation, which she did get. And then finally, I think my grandma, I think, refused to even take the money. So, and there was a big family fight about that, whether, you should take money for this, because it seemed like a kind of like a hush money kind of payout. So there was also an assumption that if you got paid out, or, you acknowledged it, that you acknowledged that something was wrong, So there was a lot of conflicted ideas about it. My family, I think a lot of Okinawans in Hawaii at the time in the 1930s and early 40s tried to assimilate to Japanese culture in Hawaii. And I think that was a double-edged sword, because Okinawan people, right, kind of really, in some cases, rejected Japanese national identity. And that was actually seen in the foundation of the Okinawan Chikoen Temple, which was founded because of the prejudice against Okinawans from the Japanese population. So it's a sort of double-edged sword. You want to assimilate, but then when you assimilate, then you become part of that group. So I wonder, I always kind of became curious about why or how the cultural identity of Okinawan people who were labeled as Japanese or who were put into camps really kind of started to feel about this sort of national identity being put onto them. Now, the other thing I want to sort of like bring up, and I don't know, because I'm also trying to search for a lot of these answers myself, about how my family either experienced the camps or rebuilt the camps after now only one surviving member of my family who was in the camps is there, and he's pretty up there in age. So, a lot of times I think that this is a kind of history that, I've only been seeing talked about in the last few years. I think that this is one of the spaces we heard earlier last week about global Okinawan voices in relation to World War II. And I heard from a lot of those panelists that they were, maybe this is the first generation where people are not ashamed of being Okinawan, or they're maybe not ashamed of talking about the incarceration of Okinawan and Japanese people as if it is something to be ashamed of in Hawaii, right? Because I think like in Hawaii, we have there's that kind of a split identity of like, if you went into the camps, that means you did something wrong, or you were a troublemaker, so these kinds of things became attached to the people who then returned outside of the camps, right? A lot of people, like my own family, they moved out of Ava, Schofield area, and they moved to on the other side of the island to Waiahole. So there was a kind of it wasn't like, and this is a phenomenon I think you see on the continent here. I was just telling Kyle right before we started here that I work nearby in southern New Jersey by Seabrook Farms, which took on about 2,500 Japanese, US Japanese Americans and Japanese Peruvians who were interned in Texas. And so we see this kind of displacement of people all over this continent after 1945. In Hawaii, it's a much smaller place. So it's not like you can really run that far on a small island. And then, trying to rebuild from that. So I'm open to answer any questions from either the panelists or the audience. I'm going to stop there so that I can let Eric speak, but I don't have very many other stories, but I'm really excited to hear from everyone else. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Adam. That I'm hearing some themes emerging between these different stories. So thank you for sharing that, and looking forward to the
May
conversation.
I? This is Betty. May I hear?
Yes, Betty. Did you have
Hello?
something to?
Yeah. Well, make something here.
Yes. Did you have something to
Okay.
share?
Out of all
Yeah.
churches, my understanding was that the Quakers were the ones who really cared about the Japanese Americans being in and Quakers even turned up in some of the camps to be teachers, and
Oops.
the other groups, Christian groups, aligned themselves with their former
Oops, we can't hear you.
You broke up there towards the
broken
end.
Can't hear.
But I think you're talking about in the East Coast here. I'm not an expert in the histories of the people who were coming here. In fact, I'm sort of ashamed that we didn't have the map, that beautiful map that Densho put up of like all the different sites. I've been living here in the East Coast for like 20 years, but not always just in this area. But it wasn't until I started working at my university in near Atlantic City that I heard about Seabrook Farms. Like, so it wasn't a really well-known story to me. Of course, like everybody heard about Manzanar, whatever, I think like Tule Lake or something like that in California, Northern California, but we don't hear too much about the Arkansas, Texas camps. These camps down here in the, that's the furthest east, and then we don't hear too much about how those people moved out here. So like one of the things that I really was surprised by was how nearby, when we talk about the institutional nature of this incarceration, there wasn't an area in the US, in the continental US, that wasn't affected in some way by this mass dislocation of people. Like people always talk about relocation, right? But really it's a dislocation of people. A lot of people didn't have homes to come back to. So I'm really interested in exploring more of the history that's here in the East Coast, because I'm totally not aware of all of those kinds of histories.
Well, thank you, Adam. So I'd like to move along to give Eric a chance to share. Eric, aloha, you here? Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, aloha kako. Mahalo, everybody. Mahalo again to all of you. And so nice to hear those stories from especially Betty and Elsie and Adam. For me, I don't really have any family that was in the camps, but I was asked to share about the Okinawa POWs that I've talked to, and also kind of helped when they had when two survivors, actually I think they're the last two survivors in Okinawa, that came to look for the remains of 12 of the Okinawa POWs who died in the camps during the war. But anyway, to give you a background, it's kind of different, I guess, also in a way, because the Okinawa POWs are the Okinawa, I guess, men who were fighting in the war for the Japanese army. They didn't volunteer; they were forced into the war, and many of them were put on the front lines and sacrificed first, and then also they really had to watch out, like when they spoke with each other or when they spoke outside, because many of them, if they spoke the Okinawan language, which was their first language that they grew up with, they were labeled as spies and taken and killed by the Japanese military too. So these were actually like high school boys, yeah, many of them that were taken in and forced to fight in a war. Especially the Battle of Okinawa, which was a sacrifice of the Okinawa people by the Japanese government to bid time, as they knew that they were losing the war and they were going to surrender. But instead of having the Americans go on to pure Japanese soil, they decided that they're going to bide time by sacrificing the people of Ryukyu, of Okinawa, because Okinawans are not by blood Japanese. So after the war, they had the camps in Okinawa, and they rounded up the POWs, and then because there was such a big concentration, from what I was told from Okinawa, because of the big concentration of civilians that they had to take care of in Okinawa, they transferred the Japanese, including the Okinawan POWs, to Hawaii. And the first place that they were put in is at Honolulu. So difference, I guess, from the continental US internment camps was that I guess if you're talking about how strict it was, it wasn't as strict, because they did a lot of work off the campsite, which meant that they had contact with the public. And around that area, especially in the Eva area, there were still a lot of Okinawan families that lived or that lived and grew up in the Honolulu camps or in the Eva camps. So they would be passing by and they would hear these POWs talking, recognize the Okinawa language, and approach them, and they would talk, and they were allowed actually to converse, and the Okinawa people in the community would bring food for them, or even have them over at their house. So we can see that it wasn't that strict at that time. But from what I was told later, many of them were transferred over to Mokua Kulikuli, to Sand Island, to where it was a little bit more strict, and it was there that many of the Okinawa POWs experienced deep depression, because for one, they were taken away from their home, and they were already feeling this, like they were forced to be in this situation. They had to be taken away from their home. They never knew if they were going to go back again. And then from one camp, they got transferred over to another. In San Island or Mokua Kulikuli, it was a little bit more confined and not so much community close by to that area. So many of the Okinawa POWs became depressed and would stop eating. They actually went on like a hunger strike. The U.S. military became concerned about their health and asked the Okinawa community for help. So one of the stories that we heard from the Ikehara family, Ikehara Sensei, who was one of the first generation Sanshin senseis in Hawaii, they were asked to go and play music for these guys, but they couldn't enter the camps. They would stand by the fence and start playing the music. And finally, when those guys heard the sound of the sanshin and the singing, they came out, and they started talking with them and started to feel a lot better. And then we many of us know, like how Adam was talking about Jikoeng, which was the center for Okinawa gatherings, especially after the war, because prior to the war there was no galvanized Okinawa association, and this is documented in some of the history books and the Gushikawa Club or Village's anniversary book, and it says that they weren't there were different clubs and clan clubs, but they couldn't get together to be galvanized until after the war, when they sent after they heard about the devastation in Okinawa, and they sent the pigs over and the goats for Okinawa. But also at that time, the priest or the bonsang at that time was Yamazato Sensei, Jika Yamazato, and he was taken and put into the camps, and was there for I believe a couple years until 1945. And at that time, also during that time, there was someone who took over his duties from the Miyasato family, and they started to, with the Okinawa community, petition the Hawaii government and the U.S. government to allow for the continuation of services and things like that. So Jikoeng was actually one of the first Buddhist temples to be allowed to continue services and continue public gatherings at that kind of venues. But hearing from what Elsie and Betty was talking about, and even Adam, I think these stories are really, really important. Because especially like when you hear about how Betty and Elsie's mom had to cook she didn't know where the next meal was coming from, and I think it was it was like that for a lot of people, especially those who were incarcerated or had family that were in there. The person who was the moneymaker for the family was all of a sudden not there, and I think there's a lot of families who are still suppressing or have these stories, but it hasn't come out because of the shame, or because again there's this thing about we're Americans now, and let's forget about the past already and move forward. But I think that kind of mindset also leads to what we have now in Hawaii with racism, and also settler colonialism, where when we forget about what's happening or what happened during our ancestors' times or with the first generation, and we forget about these hard times and where we came from, that we forget like what Adam and Betsy and Elsie was talking about, where they looked at when they were asked about were they looked down upon at school because of what happened to them and things like that. And it made me think about how sometimes the current Asian community looks down at other people within the community, like the Hawaiians and the Pacific Islanders and the Micronesians, etc. And forgetting about what happened really to our ancestors, and that we were in those situations at one time too. Yeah. So it's a good thing to bring out these stories as education, so that we don't forget, and we use it as lessons to go forward, so that we can support each other.
Great. Thank you, Eric. That's an amazing story, and I never knew about that before. You raised a really important point, and that's something I wanted to open up for our discussion. Is just how the selective incarceration of people from Hawaii created a different kind of political dynamic, I think, than on the continent. Whereas there, everyone shared the trauma and the hardship of being removed and then put in camps. But here it was like certain people were taken out, and it was done in a very secretive way. And it was almost like, oh, well, what did you do wrong then, right? There was a kind of the stigma that attaches, and that affected, Elsie and Betty's father. It affected Adam's family and the struggles that were going on. So I want to just ask, you folks about your thoughts about that. Like what are the legacies of this trauma, right? And by not talking about it, like you're saying, Eric, by not talking about it and sort of owning that trauma and then carrying it responsibly into solidarity with other groups, what is the cost of not remembering and not speaking about it?
Can I just answer, because there's a question from the audience about why my grandma and were targeted, and to be honest, I don't know. That's also a kind of a that's a kind of legacy about not talking about it, right? So now most of them are all passed, so I can't ask. But the two predominant theories are that they didn't have an income to sustain for 3 small children, and so they went to join him in the camp. That's the predominant one. But again, I don't know the context around that. But to go back to what Kyle was just bringing up here, and I think that this is the legacy of not talking about it, and also the way that it's stigmatized in Hawaii, is what you saw after 2001 with Muslims, right? The idea of the bad Muslim versus the good Muslim. And it creates that same dynamic. I mean, we saw it, many people saw it in Hawaii. They saw it in California in the 1960s. Yuri Kochiyama and others, right, who kind of fought against, like, stood with Black people, Indigenous people. But what you see is that, after 9/11, you saw that the good Muslim, bad Muslim, is the same kind of dynamic happened in Hawaii, where you had the bad Japanese, the good one. Who were the good ones, right? Who were the bad ones? The ones who then wrapped themselves in the flag, the Daniel Inouye's of the world, the ones who, utilized the narrative of the 442nd to show their patriotism, right? So then we see that kind of political dynamic emerging really early on, and you see it as well in the more modern era. I think like that's if there's one thing that we can learn about the post 1945 era is that the dynamics are there, and we see it. It might be much more intense now. It might have a different kind of intensity, and a kind of a duration that's different, because there hasn't been a korematsu decision in the Supreme Court, right? Like for the Muslims, we still have a camp in Guantanamo Bay that's holding people who have never been charged, right? For 20 years, right? Afghanistan was invaded for 20 years. And, so if we're looking for that dynamic, we see it right in front of us right now.
And you reminded me also of the these camps for the undocumented migrant children, right?
Of course, that
living in dog pens, basically.
Yeah, and privatized now, right? So now it's privatized. So now we have private corporations who profit on that.
Anyone else have any thoughts on this issue, like the legacy of the camps and how it affected the families or the communities?
This is Betty. Most of us were kind of in the dark because, number one, we were very young, so we didn't know what questions to ask. But even afterwards, I think there was a veil of silence on parts of certain families to talk about the system because it was a sad time. And some of the information, and in my case, for I don't know, several years ago, after I'd been in college even, to find out what had happened. And some of the information I found out from what I had thought as a child, because nothing was directly that clear to me when I was a child as to why of all people was in camp and what had he done that I never knew. And then I found out he didn't do anything bad. It was
Oh, we lost Betty. Oh no. Okay. Well, Elsie or Eric, you have any thoughts you want to share on?
I just recalled Betty and I were talking about this, that my dad had some books, Japanese books. And because I know he told me that he learned how to do like bonsai by reading a book. Because I asked him, Dad, can you teach me how to do that? He goes, no, because I learned it from a book. I said, if you learn it from a book, you can teach me how to do bonsai, But anyway, my dad had a number of Japanese books, and what he did, because he was so afraid, he got these books and he buried them in our backyard. Betty and I were talking about that. I asked Betty, do you remember that? She said, yeah. So evidently, even written material that was, nothing subversive or anything. Just simple things like how you do bonsai, or how to do some other things. They just, he just was so scared that he just dug a hole and buried those books.
Yeah, no, I think that's a common story of like people were trying to disavow their Japanese ancestry, right? To hide for safety.
Yeah.
In our family, we didn't have anyone, at least that I know, that was close to us that were incarcerated. But my grandfather lost his job at Pearl Harbor immediately, right? He was an electrician. And my great grandfather on my mom's side was actually formerly Japanese Navy, like during the 1890s. And so that could have been really bad for them, right? If that knowledge had come out. And so I think they kind of suppressed it and got rid of all the Japanese heirlooms and things just to sort of blend in, right, as to pass, so that they wouldn't come under scrutiny. But yeah, there's a lot of fear, I think.
Yeah, there was.
There's another question here.
Betty, our phone just rang and my husband answered it and he said it was Betty. She said she got cut off. She can't, because she's not able to communicate with us from her phone. So I guess, yeah. But that's okay. Yeah.
Okay, well, hopefully maybe the support team can help reconnect her But we have a question from Sarah. It says, Aloha Auntie Elsie, would you please compare your experience growing up in Hawaii with Uncle Walter's experience growing up in California and Topaz?
Oh, yeah, I guess it was really different because although he was, he was a youngster, he was like 3 years old or something when he went to the camp. But I don't know if he had any, any bad experiences, to say, not like we did, having our dad, to be torn away from our family for I don't know how long. So I guess, I guess my husband Walt was, he had a more, I guess it wasn't really normal because they had they had rules, I guess, too. But but at least it wasn't as bad, I think, as we did. That's what I think. That's what I think. But I got to ask him later what he thought. Yeah.
So he was a young boy in the camp.
Yeah, he was a young boy in the camp. Yeah, and they were able, and there were other kids to play with and such, But so did we, but not in a very. I guess we had this, in our mind, we weren't as happy as we could have been if our dad was at home with us.
Right, right, of course.
Not really like a family for a while, Yeah, but so it might be a little different for him, for my husband. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. No, that's again, it shows how the experiences were really different. Yeah, by separating families or bringing them all together, you had different opportunities to maintain community or not, right?
Correct.
Maintaining those bonds. Yeah. See, I wanted to just mention one thing that was I think was a little bit unique about Hawaii is that we were under martial law for 3 years. So even though not everyone was put in the camps, in a way, the whole island was like a concentration camp, right? It was controlled so tightly, media, money, economy, jobs, courts. And so there's different degrees, I guess, of control that were established in the exclusion zone on the West Coast, and then Hawaii was treated as a martial law area, right? Military rule. See, another question? Oh no. Do we have Betty? Oh, hi Betty. Welcome back.
Oh.
Let's see. I had another kind of thought. I just wanted to throw in. Because thanks, Eric, for bringing up the questions about like what are our responsibilities today, right? As Japanese in Hawaii, settlers in Hawaiian lands, right? And in many cases, the concentration camps on the continent were in indigenous people's lands, and so there's conversations now going on about, what does it mean when land was taken from indigenous people and then used to incarcerate, persons of Japanese ancestry. And here in Hawaii, especially places like Honouliuli, right? It's in the Ewa district, and you have a history of dispossession. I mean, Pu'uloa or Pearl Harbor, right, was a valuable and productive resource for Hawaiian people before America took over and turned it into a military base, right? And so when the war comes, you have, people losing all kinds of livelihood and land. And there was a petition I came across doing research in the Hiram Fong's archive. He was a senator from Hawaii. There was a petition submitted to him by the Pu'uloa Farmers Association, most of whom were of Japanese and Okinawan descent. And I guess they had farms in the Ewa Plains, kind of going out towards Ewa Beach area. And they were all lost. They lost their land, they lost their investments, and were dispossessed. And so they were petitioning for some kind of redress or some kind of justice, and there are hundreds of them, right? And so there are all these degrees of trauma that have lingered, I think, in our communities, and remembering places like Honouliuli, places like Sand Island, and these other camps, Kalaheo, and the trauma that goes on there, and then linking it to other people's experiences of dispossession, might be a bridge, I guess, to begin thinking about, okay, how do we work for our common justice and healing from these past episodes of injustice and oppression. Yeah. I don't know. Do folks have any thoughts about what we can do moving forward? I guess.
Yeah, Kyle, the thing that really struck me from like what I said, when they were talking about being labeled as doing something wrong, or like because they were put into these camps and how they were looked at. I think it's important for us to look at that, because what kind of paralleled to me and reminded me, and I talk about this to people who I think need to understand, and how I became awoke too, is that when I was going to elementary school, Hawaiian language was still against the law in public school. It wasn't allowed to be taught until 1985, right? And I remember my classmates in class being made to sit in the back of the class, the Samoan and the Hawaiian students, and they didn't do anything bad, but the teachers would tell them, all of your family, they're all in prison. They all do bad stuff. You guys are going to end up like that. And a couple of my friends said something in Hawaiian, and the teacher put masking tape on their mouths, and they were told not to speak Hawaiian in class. And these were Japanese and Okinawan ancestry teachers. So by listening to these stories, you kind of think, okay, they forgot where they came from. Or, sometimes you ask people who think like that, why do you think that way? Why do you look down on these people? And they tell you, well, I worked my way up. I got educated. It's all about this so-called privilege that they have, not realizing the layers and generations of trauma that the Pacific Islanders and the Hawaiians have gone through and still going through. So I think by understanding our own histories, especially for the Okinawans, it's still happening in Okinawa too. But then, we're desensitized, and the Hawaii diaspora, majority of them are kind of like disconnected. That's the problem there. That's not our problem. So it's like, yeah, like what you said, how do you move forward, or how do you get these people to understand?
Yeah. That you touched on that this model minority myth is so seductive, right? Like having to redeem ourselves after being enemy aliens, and then after the war, that story takes over of the heroic, Japanese American, the patriotism and all of that to redeem our honor or our status, but which means, or it in this case, like you're describing, Eric, right? It turns into a putting down of somebody else, right? Because we made it, and it's not considering that there are structural reasons why, Japanese and Okinawans could move up, but holding others back, right? In at least in Hawaii society, that way. I'm sorry, I cut you off, Betty. Did you have something to share?
Yes, and another thing that I think I found out, I don't know if it's true or not because I was never in camp, that among the Christian churches, the Quakers were the ones who showed up to see their parishioners off if they were going to camp, and the other Christian groups were kind of cold to the situation. That's what I was told. I don't know because I was not in camp. But on the mainland, therefore, when I used to go there, and I have a friend named William Lederer, the author of The Ugly American, he and I used to go in Vermont to the Society of Friends Church because he felt the same way, that the Friends showed when it was important that members of their congregation who were Japanese Americans, if they were going to camp, they were seeing them off and wishing them well, whereas perhaps other churches didn't do that.
Well, thanks for pointing that out. I used to work for the American Friends Service Committee, so it's a Quaker
Yeah,
associated organization,
right.
and that was one of the things that I think they did, honorably, was to stand up against this kind of discrimination. And at least in Hawaii, that was the first iteration of the organization. It's popped up during World War II to help Japanese, Americans who are incarcerated, and provide different kind of support, but also to
Yeah, I was really impressed because I used to go to a Baptist church in Koloa,
Oh,
Hawaii,
yeah.
and I said the Baptists are okay, but hey, who shows up when times are tough? Evidently, the Society of Friends, the Quakers showed up to wish their Japanese American friends well when they went to camp, and some of them went in and even helped teach classes and so on in the camp.
Okay. Well, thanks for sharing that. That's a great historical fact to know they did that. So I think we're kind of over time actually. So I don't want to keep our audience or keep our panelists too long. But did you all have any last thoughts you want to share before we sign off?
I just want to say thanks everyone again, because this is like, this is like part of I feel like this is part of the first steps, towards like acknowledging and thinking about, like, really in really good ways, thinking about how to, kind of deal with these histories of trauma. So I really want to thank everyone for the opportunity.
Hello.
Well, let's hope it never happens again, that a whole group is incarcerated because it's of a specific, race or creed or whatever it may be. That we must not let this happen again.
Yeah. Thank you, Betty. I echo your sentiments. Support that. Elsie, did you have any last thoughts?
I have it written down, just the same thing.
Oh,
We don't want
okay.
it to happen again to any other group of people. So, yeah, it's
Right.
something that you don't want to see ever again.
Right on. Thank you. Eric, any last words?
Same as everybody. Mahalo to Kihiko and the Japanese American pilgrimages, and for creating this space and the various spaces that are available during this series. Yeah, very, very valuable. Mahalo.
Well, thank you all for being on the panel and sharing your stories with us, enriching us with them, and for helping us think through, how to be better allies, how to build this kind of solidarity so it never happens again. I want to thank our audience for showing up, and hopefully next year, if there's a next year, we can do something similar and build on this conversation. So mahalo to all, and
Thank you.
take care. Aloha.
Thank you.
Aloha.